fluids move in your body. They can move within the extracellular fluid compartment, right? So you might remember this image from chapter 21. We were talking about how plasma, which is part of our extracellular fluid, can become interstitial fluid, right? That process of filtration pushed water out to bathe the cells. Most of it, we said, got reabsorbed, but the rest of it, that interstitial fluid became plasma, right, which eventually ends up back in the venous system as plasma. So we go from plasma to interstitial fluid to lymph back to plasma, right? So we know we can move between those compartments of extracellular fluid. That's basically based off of, remember, the hydrostatic pressures, the blood pressure that was pushing fluid out, and those colloid osmotic pressures, right, the proteins and cells left behind that are drawing the fluids back in. Also, in the tissues, you have a hydrostatic pressure, right, that's trying to force those fluids or keep those fluids from getting pushed out. And there's also, salts and cells and proteins and all that does have an osmotic draw there as well. So it's really hydrostatic pressures and osmotic pressures that are going to determine that movement. Hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure are what determine our movements within the extracellular fluid. Am I plasma? Am I interstitial fluid? Am I lymph? Am I cerebrospinal fluid? Am I serous fluid? Right? All those things. Okay. We also can move between the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. So intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid. Again, in practice, right, in the clinic, we assume about 2/3 of our fluids are intracellular fluid, 1/3 extracellular fluid. Now the big picture here is basically that ICF acts as a reserve, because notice what happens here. So if the extracellular fluid volume starts to decrease, I'm picturing this happening as I'm sweating, right? Something like that. As that volume decreases, notice what happens. The solution becomes hypertonic. Now, I know with sweating, you're thinking, but you're losing all these salts as well. The amount of salt you lose in sweat is actually really minuscule. It's just if you keep sweating and sweating and sweating, that salt builds up, okay? So work with me here, right? We're losing fluids, but we're assuming the salts are more or less the same. And so we are becoming, this extracellular fluid becomes hypertonic. Compared to the ICF, right? Water follows salt. So fluids from our ICF, water is going to move into the extracellular fluid, bump the volume up, right? We don't get all the way back to normal, right? But it brings it back up, and we decrease the intracellular fluid volume. So this is a really nice little kind of buffer against fluid loss, that we can pull some fluid from the cells. But notice this only fixes the problem for so long, right? Because in something like a true dehydration, if this loss continues, right? Say we do this again, the intracellular fluid brought the extracellular fluid volume back up. We can keep running our marathon, but we're still sweating. And so what happens if we drop this again, right? This becomes hypertonic, and the cells try to donate some water, right? And it's not even, they're not trying to be nice, it's just that water follows salt. If this is hypertonic, water will leave the cells to make up for that. But we can really only do this for so long, right? We'll hit a point where that extracellular fluid volume has dropped enough that we start affecting things like as we decrease blood volume. We know that this leads to a decrease in blood pressure, right? And if we can't up that extracellular fluid volume for some reason, if we can't correct this problem, this can lead to hypovolemic shock. Right? Where you just don't have enough blood to perfuse all those tissues, right? So dehydration can be a big problem there. The other thing that you'll notice that happens, right, is as that extracellular fluid volume is becoming hypertonic, as it's becoming really salty, what we have right? Basically, at the same time that the body would be sensing this volume loss, it's also sensing hypernatremia, really high levels of salt. And as our body is sensing these high salt levels, it's going to trigger things like antidiuretic hormone to tell the kidney to conserve as much water as possible, right? Try to up the extracellular fluid volume and dilute the saltiness, right? Remember, ADH, you reabsorb water at the kidney, and it also stimulates thirst, right? So you should be going like, I should stop at the next aid station and drink water, all right? So that's kind of what's happening if extracellular fluid volume is decreasing and ICF is acting as a bit of a buffer or a reserve, right? It can't really fix the problem. We do need something like ADH to come in and tell us to input more and lose less, but it buys us some time. Now, the exact opposite thing can happen as well, right? So hydrate and die. You can run into situations of overhydration as well, right? Overhydration or hyponatremia. So let's think about what this would look like. See if I can do this on this picture. Okay, so if you drink too much, right, and you increase the extracellular fluid volume, right, you're upping, say, the plasma levels, this extracellular fluid volume is increasing, and it's becoming more dilute. So it's, hypotonic. Good there, right? It's hypotonic. It's more dilute because we've added water but not more salt. Now the ICF is going to act as a reserve because water follows salt. If this is less salty, water wants to move this way, right? So water from this kind of excess volume is going to move into cells, right? Raising the intracellular fluid volume, but maybe bringing extracellular fluid down some, right? So it's not quite so excessive. But this really leads us to a big problem here, right? When you become what's called hyponatremic, when those salt levels are so being diluted by how much water you're putting into the ECF, water flowing into those cells makes the cells swell. This is a less desirable way to act as a buffer than by adding water to the ECF. When these cells swell, the first cells that typically are affected are your neurons. They are very sensitive to pressure. So as they start swelling, it's hard to send action potentials, those sorts of things. And you can actually go have seizures, slip into a coma, and die from hyponatremia, from overhydration or having those low salt levels, right? Now, ideally what's going to happen as extracellular fluid volume is increasing, right? That's when we want things like ANP and BNP to step in and tell us to go ahead and pee, right, and flush that out, okay? But it does happen, right? Particularly we see this hyponatremia in, say, marathoners or maybe even longer distances where they might be drinking water a lot, right? They've been told to be careful not to get dehydrated. We hear that as athletes all the time. 2% dehydration or more really starts to affect the functioning, the performance of cells, which is true. And so you just keep drinking and drinking. and you can get hyponatremia. So they've actually even imposed rules for aid stations in marathons. They have to be certain distances apart to try to prevent this. Anyway, if you have some salts and stuff, you're gonna be okay. That's the attempt of Gatorade, to put some electrolytes in there and make it so it's not such an osmotic push into cells. But even Gatorade is not isotonic, and so if you just are drinking Gatorade, you can still end up with hyponatremia. Anyway, watch out for that one. So there's a couple really nice kind of flow charts in your book. So this is 27.5, basically saying, okay, we want homeostasis of, in this case, sodium levels in the extracellular fluid. If those levels start getting higher, right, and think about how they would get more concentrated sodium. That was the example of dehydration, right? Notice the hypothalamus is stimulated to secrete antidiuretic hormone. We've reabsorbed more water in the kidney, and that's going to get us back to those better levels, right? So we return to homeostasis. We can do this the exact opposite way. If we have decreased levels of sodium, and again, remember, the body isn't saying like, oh, she's only got 27 grams. It's looking at that osmolarity. So that decreased saltiness can be from intaking too much water, right? Osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are inhibited. We decrease antidiuretic hormone secretion. We pee more out at the kidney, and that brings us back to sodium levels, right? I like these little flow charts. 27.6 here, again, trying to show you how intertwined fluid and electrolyte balance is, right? So here we're saying normal extracellular fluid volume. If the extracellular fluid volume is increasing, right, and notice this can be by fluid gain or fluid and sodium gain, right, we're going to start stretching. Heart cells, ANP and BNP are lost, right, and so we start peeing, we inhibit ADH, right, we reduce the volume and we're fixed. If fluid volume is being lost, again, think of like dehydration, or fluid and sodium, as that blood pressure and volume decreases, right, we'll increase renin secretion, we'll get aldosterone, ADH, tell us to reabsorb those and increase blood volume and blood pressure, right? So maybe you spend a little time checking those out. Again, the interesting thing here is how connected, really, that these are. So we see the really important role of sodium as helping with water reabsorption, right? So maintaining blood volume, we think about it that way a lot. But keep in mind that it also has its own role. So things like nerve conduction in neurons, or being able to stimulate muscular contraction. So those sodium levels are important. There's lots of different electrolytes, clearly, that play roles. I just want to mention potassium and calcium. And so with potassium, right, again, basically you're gaining this through your diet, you're losing it through the kidney, and you need certain levels of potassium, right? We said that was the major intracellular cation. What we're going to see is really the losses are determined at the kidney. And here's the big picture. If potassium levels fall too low, you can develop what's called hypokalemia, right? Low potassium levels. Notice what happens. Muscular weakness, eventual paralysis. We see effects on the heart, arrhythmias, and they're even pointing out potentially lethal cardiac events there. Okay. It would definitely show up some irregularities on EKG, those sorts of things, right? Notice what ends up causing hypokalemia. You absolutely can have endocrine disorders, and we'll talk about the role of aldosterone. But basically, too much aldosterone causes hypokalemia, because remember, in that distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct, right, where aldosterone has its effect, aldosterone is putting in these transporters, and aldosterone tells us to reabsorb, that's a terrible arrow, reabsorb sodium, but it has to trade it for another cation, right, and so we usually trade it for potassium. So aldosterone increases the loss of potassium. aldosterone increases potassium loss. Okay, and so in a situation where you have like a tumor or a disorder where you're secreting excess aldosterone, this would be problematic. The other place they're pointing out here is that's often how we see, well, this is a weird one, how we see some diuretics working. So not sodium reabsorption, but just they're trying to get you to pee and pee and pee, and you're flushing, right, all of these electrolytes out, sodium and potassium, but potassium ends up being a bigger problem most of the time, okay? Hyperkalemia, high potassium levels can also happen, and this is much more common when we see something like acidic conditions. Let's think through this one. So if you, so in the DCT again, all right, when we're looking to reabsorb sodium, if you're in an acidic condition and there's just a bunch of hydrogen hanging out, this is the way that we actually get rid of hydrogen to maintain our blood pH, is we trade it for sodium. But normally it would be potassium getting secreted. And so if you're constantly trying to dump acid, you're gonna end up building up those potassium levels. So chronically low body fluid pH, so an acidotic condition, right? Other things would be like kidney failure, right, problematic, as well as other diuretics, and this is kind of interesting, diuretics fall on either side because some diuretics block sodium reabsorption, right? And so you're not getting rid of potassium, again, that way. Anyway, if you have hyperkalemia, it can be just as bad, right? Things like cardiac arrhythmias show up on either side of this as well. Okay, calcium. Calcium is our last electrolyte, and then we'll move on to pH. So again, this should be review, right? That parathyroid hormone is the hormone that helps us increase blood calcium levels, right? While calcitonin is our hormone that tells us to decrease blood calcium levels. They work on the same three organs, right? The bone, the small intestine, and the kidney, right? Do we need to, in this case, do we need osteoclast to release calcium from the bone? Do we need the intestine to absorb more? And do we need the kidney to reabsorb, right? So parathyroid hormone works on the kidney as well to get us to up our blood calcium levels, right? Now, if this is excessive, you can end up with hypercalcemia. And in hypercalcemia, you will see things like cardiac arrhythmias, calcium deposits in strange places in the body, right? So this is problematic. And think about that, cardiac arrhythmias. Remember the role of calcium in cardiac muscle contraction? It's what gave us that plateau. And so it's and more in cardiac muscle than skeletal muscle, because in skeletal muscle, the calcium was all in that sarcoplasmic reticulum inside of the cell. Cardiac muscle is much more attuned. It uses some of the calcium in the extracellular fluid, and so you run into problems with too much calcium, right? And then calcium deposits, right? Whether it's things like kidney stones, or you can get calcium deposits in different organs, etc. Okay. Calcitonin, right, decreasing blood calcium levels, basically by doing the opposite thing here, you can run into hypocalcemia, and again, you get things like muscle spasms, arrhythmias, and in this case, you could actually run into something like osteoporosis as well, right? So if blood calcium levels are chronically low, you would basically keep trying to up them, with osteoclast activity, and so you'd be taking that from the bone. Anyway, so hypercalcemia, hypocalcemia, problematic. This is often a problem with something like the thyroid or parathyroid gland. Typically, I would say parathyroid hormone not working properly, either being excessive or deficient. Now, all your other electrolytes, magnesium, phosphate, all of those, again, need to stay in balance, and it's the ins versus the outs, and you can certainly get more in depth here, but let's just keep it with sodium, potassium, and calcium as our electrolytes.